Hello everyone, Steve Burns here, and we had one of our members in the forum have a question about how to improve their photograph, and this one's by Jan, and Jan has posted an image of a more of sun rays coming through the sky as we can see here and spilling over the ocean. Now I chose to address this because I'm seeing this often in terms of people or individuals who have a little bit a more of a beginning level understanding of tonal values and how they affect the depth in your image and how to achieve that. Some quick and easy ways to achieve that. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to improve the photograph. Now, keep in mind that when you're posting anything or sharing your work, that you want to have a very strong point of focus. In other words, what is the subject in your work? How are you trying to get this subject to affect the viewer? Here, the subject matter appears to be the sun rays coming through the clouds. We also have some subjects right in the back here. It looks like poles coming straight out of the water. I'm not quite sure what they are, but I'm not quite sure of the significance to the image. But I'm going to assume that the author or the artist meant those to be there. However, your subject is really about the sky and the sun rays coming through. Now, if that's the case, we want to richen those details. We want to richen the depth of tones so that those sun rays will come spilling out more as if they're speaking to the viewer looking at the photograph. And I'm going to show you a couple of quick and simple ways to achieve this. Now, I've went ahead and duplicated the layer, and I'm going to duplicate it again with a Command or Control J. Now let's work with, I'm going to turn off the top one and let's work with the one right below here. A quick and easy way of producing some rich tones within your darker values here is via the layer blend modes. Now if we come right up here to where it says normal, you have several different options here. Now you notice that the options are separated by thick dark bars. Now these thick dark bars mean something in that they're going to allow certain values to be enhanced while other values will not be touched. In other words, the darkened area would all have the same result in that the darker values will be blended with your image, while the medium gray and the brighter values, and the medium gray means some of these medium gray tones in the water as well as the bright tones up in here, will not be affected at all. So if I target darken here, darken is going to apply the tones normally as you see them currently in normal mode, but allows your medium grays and brighter values to go transparent in terms of blending with the layer underneath it. If I select the multiply, you can see the darker values become darker while the brighter values are not going to have any effect at all. So it looks as if it's gaining more contrast, but in essence is what's happening is the darker values are being pushed lower in intensity or richness, I should say, not intensity but richness, so that the brighter values are standing out, and thus we can see the highlights coming much more stronger through the cloud formations. And as we go down further, color burn. All right, the darker values get darker. They all have the same effect in that the darker values will be affected while the brighter values are not being touched. And as you go down further, the darken color is going to give you something similar to darken. The same thing with this here, lighten. You'll see the brighter colors as you see them normally in the normal blend mode being blended with the layer underneath it. Now as we go down the line, just as this group up here had maintained the darker values or accentuated the darker values, the lighten is going to do the exact same thing to the opposite range of tones, which is your brighter values. Screen, notice that the brights are being affected while the darker values are going to have little to no effect. Color dodge, linear dodge, and so forth. Now just to keep this fair, the overlay, this section maintains your brighter values and darker values and will not touch your medium grays. So if we go to the overlay, in essence what it's doing is increasing the darker values as well as brightening up the brighter values, and the midtones are not being touched. So as we go down, there's soft light. It's a softer version of overlay. Hard lights even harsher, If we go down to vivid light, that's even harsher, okay? So you're favoring darker values and brighter values over the medium gray values, giving you higher contrast. Now, what we're really interested in this case is your multiply, because it's really bringing out those darker, deeper tones. If I turn this off, before and after, before and after. So here you lack the deeper tones. Therefore, the rays and the lights weren't really coming out dynamically as they should. So I'm going to turn this back on. Now, this is 100% layer blend mode. You can also adjust the layer blend mode to your taste. All right. So that's one way. I'm going to go ahead and keep that the way it is. And I'm going to turn on the top layer, which is in normal blend mode at 100%. Another way you can deal with this is go to your filter menu and access your, what do we have now in the new version of Photoshop? We have Camera Raw filter. Target it, and it's going to open it up in Camera Raw. Now this is also dealing with values. If you look at this panel in the basic mode, we're dealing with shadows, midtones, and highlights. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit. I'm hitting Control plus, space bar, move it around, and we have our darker values right down here. We have the brighter values we can see in the sky, and of course our medium tone or medium gray values more in the water and in some locations within the clouds. Exposure is dealing with your shadows, midtones, and highlights equally. Brighten them up, they all brighten equally. Take them down, they all darken equally. Alright, I'm going to put it right back in the middle, or I can double click here to go back to 0. Contrast is actually pulling the lower values and the higher values further apart from one another, thus favoring higher contrast over a continuous tone image. Continuous tone meaning a deep black, lots of medium grays to a nice bright white with detail. So if I pull this to the left, you can see we're lacking contrast. We're pulling away those darker values. We're pulling down those higher values, meaning the brights. If I pull it to the right, as the little value system here denotes, it is separating those gray tones further apart from one another, thus giving you a deeper black and a richer white. All right, let's not mess with the contrast either, because what contrast is doing is actually destroying a lot of the detail in your shadows and the highlights, or it can, to the point where it's very hard to recover. What I prefer you to do is to just deal with shadows and highlights independently, which is what Adobe has allowed us to do here. Highlights will only target the brighter values, see? So I'm making extreme adjustments to see exactly what this slider is doing. It's targeting only the brighter values or the whites. I'm going to pull it down because that's giving me some nice detail in these highlights. Now that we have detail in the highlights, what about the shadows? We want to get a nice pop going here, or some depth, some rich tones, medium tones, bright tones that gives you almost a three-dimensional looking scene. So if I target the shadow, pull the shadows up, see what happens to the lower values? They become brighter. Bring it down. You see what's going on here? We're targeting the lower values and the brighter values independent from one another. Gives you much more control. Now, we can go to the extreme highlights. Make them brighter. You see that? The extreme highlights in here. Making them brighter or further reducing them down so that we can get a little more detail. I think I want to keep them right about where it is in 0. Let's go to the blacks and see what happens here. Now I'm getting a much more deeper, richer black, and I'm going to go a little richer in the darker values. I think it's going to help the brighter values pop out a little bit more. And I can always go to the exposure and just bring everything up just slightly. Okay, exposure again is affecting all shadows, middle tones, and highlights equally. Now, your clarity is a type of a sharpening, but it's also adding some some contrast to it as well. So this is what we refer to the mid-tone sharpening. So when we started messing around with our highlights and our shadows, the mid-tone was somewhat sacrificed in terms of sharpness. So if we go to clarity and pull it to the right, watch what happens. All right, really starts to sharpen up, especially in that water. I like that for this particular scene. If you go back the other way, you can see how soft it becomes. And of course, that can be an effect as well, if you so choose. But let's go ahead and add that nice, beautiful, aggressive detail that really makes this scene beautiful. Now, let's go ahead and click OK. And we have two versions here. One that we did in ACR, Adobe Camera Raw, okay, the filter, and one that we've done natively using the layer blend modes. Okay, so you can even use a combination of the two. And say, for example, you feel that this one is beautiful but a little bit too strong, but this one has a little bit more of the mid-tones that you really like. You can always take the top layer and blend it down, reduce it down a little bit, and blend it with the bottom layer. So you're getting the best of all the worlds here. Now, finally, in terms of talking about your primary point of focus here, in this particular scene, the sky is the focus. What's happening in this particular case is that your water is taking up a huge chunk of your scene that's really not adding any detail to the scene. It's not adding any more information that speaks about what you're trying to say as an artist. So this area becomes one huge negative space that's going to become a sore to the human eye. So let's come right up here to our toolbar. Let's go to our crop tool and let's take away that negative space that we don't need. And let's go ahead and shorten this up. Let's go ahead and hit escape here. All right, pull it up from the bottom and you have your rule of thirds, and let's take away that extra space that we really don't need. I'm thinking right about here makes it stronger. Keep in mind, if you put your mouse outside, you can rotate this, okay? But we don't need to do it. It looks like the horizon line is fairly straight with the lower the lower edge of the screen. So Jan, you did a great job in making sure that your horizon is fairly straight. There we go. I'm going to take it to right about here. Now some may argue, give it a little bit more space, but me, I really want to bring your eye directly to your primary point of focus, which is really your sky. In fact, here, I'll show you another technique when I'm thinking about it. I'll give it a little bit more space, all right? We'll hit the return key. Now we're going to do a little burning and dodging technique that's going to allow you to focus even more on the sky. So I'm going to darken this foreground area just slightly so your eye graduates, so it graduates and focuses your attention right over here onto the clouds. If we add a new layer, give it a layer blend mode and call it overlay, we can paint with white or black to brighten or darken the image. Remember, the overlay maintains your darker values and highlight values. Therefore, hit the B key for the brush, and if we start to paint, and I'm using a Wacom pen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust it right up in here so that under my transfer I'm using pen pressure. Alright, so I'm going to make the pen bigger. So using my control, I'm using a PC, control, right click, there we go, or just make the mouse bigger and smaller. I'm going to lightly paint, see, using a Wacom pen where I'm drawing everybody's. See, now your eye starts to focus in here. We can also use that same technique of adding a little bit more darkness in some of these areas. Look at that, we're bringing out detail in these areas that we need, so that the eye is now going to be focusing more toward these sun rays here. We can make the brush smaller, and we can even add a little more paint and a little more richness behind some of these rays to bring them out more. Okay, so keep that in mind. And also, so that you're aware of it, if we hit the X key to switch the foreground and background color and we paint with white, then what's going to happen? We can bring out more brightness. In other words, let's go in here get in close to some of these rays, and let's go ahead and just paint in some brightness to accentuate the highlights in some of these areas. So use your walking pen, is really important. Press down a little hard here, but release very lightly so that you have a brighter value closer to the light source, and then it fades away as it gets further away. Does that make sense? So hopefully that does. Now, if you are interested in more tutorials, go to my website, chromeillusion.com, target tutorials, and you have all types of video tutorials here. Anywhere, especially quite a few I've done for Layers Magazine, Art Rage if interested in digital painting, beginning, intermediate, advanced Photoshop, including Lightroom and 3D tutorials. So come in here, take a look at these, enjoy the site, and I look forward to sharing with you in our next set of tutorials. This is Stephen Burns signing off.